Section 3. Transactions without the knowledge or consent of all parties. Ways to lose your real estate license. Transactions without the knowledge or consent of all parties. Ashley was still flipping through the ADRE file when something immediately caught her attention. She looked at the purchase contract, then back at Michael. "Wait a minute," she said. "It looks like our brokerage represented both the buyer and the seller." Michael smiled. "Good catch." Ashley looked confused. "So, isn't that illegal?" David laughed. "Not at all. It's actually a very common transaction." Michael nodded. "Representing both parties isn't the problem. Representing both parties without everyone fully understanding what that means, that's where agents find themselves in trouble." Ashley looked back at the file. "I thought both clients simply signed the consent to limited representation form when they wrote the contract." Michael slowly closed the file. "And that's one of the biggest misconceptions in Arizona real estate." He walked over to the whiteboard and wrote, "Timing matters." Turning back toward the room, he explained that Arizona law allows a brokerage to represent both parties in the same transaction under limited representation, often referred to as dual agency by many agents. However, the law requires much more than simply obtaining signatures at the time the purchase contract is written. The key word is prior, Michael explained. Under AAC R4-28-1101-F, a salesperson or broker shall not accept compensation from or represent more than one party in a transaction without the prior written consent of all parties. That one word changes everything. Ashley looked puzzled. "I've always seen agents explain dual agency when they present the purchase contract." Michael nodded. "And sometimes that's too late." He explained that the agency relationship actually begins long before an offer is written. A seller often establishes an agency relationship when signing a listing agreement. Likewise, a buyer typically establishes an agency relationship when entering into a buyer-broker employment agreement. If a brokerage knows there is a possibility it could represent both sides of a future transaction, discussing limited representation early allows the client to make an informed decision before emotions, negotiations, and deadlines become part of the conversation. David smiled. "Think about it this way. Imagine you've spent weeks helping a buyer find the perfect home. They finally decide to make an offer, and right before they sign the contract, you tell them, 'By the way, our brokerage also represents the seller, so we'd like you to sign this consent form.'" Ashley nodded. "I can see how that might make a buyer uncomfortable." "Exactly," Michael replied. "At that point, the client may feel they have little choice because they're emotionally invested in the property. That's why the rule emphasizes prior written consent. The client deserves the opportunity to understand the agency relationship before reaching that stage of the transaction." Michael turned another page in the investigation file. "This particular complaint wasn't actually about dual agency," he explained. "The complaint involved a disagreement over repairs after the home inspection. But during the investigation, ADRE reviewed the entire transaction and discovered there was no documentation showing that limited representation had been discussed before negotiations began. The required consent was signed the same day as the purchase contract." Ashley frowned. "So what started as one complaint uncovered something completely different." Michael smiled. "Now you're beginning to understand how investigations work." "Oh," he explained that under ARS Section 32-2153A2, the commissioner may discipline a licensee who acts for more than one party in a transaction without the knowledge or consent of all parties. The administrative rule goes one step further by requiring the consent to be obtained in writing and before the representation occurs. Together, the statute and the administrative rule reinforce the same principle. Transparency builds trust, while surprises often create complaints. David leaned forward. "One of the biggest mistakes I see isn't intentional dishonesty. It's assumption. Agents assume their clients understand agency. They assume everyone knows what limited representation means. They assume because the client signed the form, the discussion happened." Michael nodded. "But signatures don't replace conversations." Ashley wrote that sentence in her notebook. "Signatures don't replace conversations." "I like that." "They don't," Michael replied. "The form documents the discussion. It doesn't create the discussion." Michael then pointed to another portion of AAC R428-1101. "The requirements for licensees don't stop with dual agency. They also require licensees to disclose conflicts of interest before parties enter into a binding agreement. For example, if you're purchasing your own listing, selling property owned by a family member, buying property from your designated broker, or you have another financial interest beyond your commission, those relationships must be disclosed in writing. Consumers deserve to know when something could influence your recommendations." Ashley smiled. "So this really comes back to protecting the public again." Michael laughed. "You're catching on. The easiest way to avoid an ethics complaint is to remove surprises from the transaction. If something could influence your advice, disclose it. If something could appear to be a conflict, disclose it. If you're wondering whether the client should know something, They probably should. David stood up and walked over to the whiteboard. I've always told my agents that sunlight solves most problems. Ashley laughed. What does that mean? It means transparency. When everyone understands what's happening, when expectations are clear, when conflicts are disclosed, when agency relationships are explained, there are far fewer complaints. Michael nodded. And that's exactly why these rules exist. He reminded the group that AAC R428-1101A begins by stating that every Arizona licensee owes a fiduciary duty to the client. That fiduciary duty requires loyalty, obedience to lawful instructions, confidentiality, accounting, disclosure, and reasonable care, while also requiring the licensee to deal fairly with every other party in the transaction. Those duties don't disappear simply because a brokerage represents both parties. Instead, they require the brokerage to carefully limit the advice it gives, while remaining completely transparent throughout the transaction. Ashley closed her notebook. I think I understand now. Dual agency isn't what gets agents into trouble. Michael smiled. Exactly. Poor communication does. Poor documentation does. Waiting until the last minute does. And forgetting that clients deserve to understand who represents whom before they make one of the biggest financial decisions of their lives. As Michael gathered the investigation file, he looked around the conference room. Every time an ADRE investigator opens a transaction file, they're asking one simple question. Did everyone understand the relationship before the transaction began? You've already eliminated one of the most common reasons licensees find themselves facing disciplinary action. Real-world Arizona example. An Arizona brokerage represented both the buyer and seller in the same residential transaction. Both parties ultimately signed the consent to limited representation form, but ADRE discovered during its investigation that the discussion about limited representation did not occur until the purchase contract was being signed. Although the parties eventually consented, the investigation questioned whether that consent was truly prior, as required under AAC R428-1101. The case became a reminder that obtaining a signature is only part of compliance. Licensees must have the conversation early enough for clients to make an informed decision before becoming contractually committed. Broker tip: never allow a form to replace a conversation. The best risk management practice is to discuss agency relationships and the possibility of limited representation when the client relationship begins, not when the purchase contract is sitting on the kitchen table waiting for signatures. Online discussion question 1. Why is obtaining prior written consent for limited representation more than simply having a client sign a form? Model answer. Prior written consent ensures the client has enough information to make an informed decision before negotiations begin. The form documents the discussion, but it should never replace a meaningful conversation about agency relationships and potential conflicts. Question 2. Michael says signatures don't replace conversations. What does he mean by that statement? Model answer. A signed disclosure demonstrates documentation, but compliance also requires that the client understand what they are signing. Licensees should explain agency relationships, answer questions, and confirm the client's understanding before obtaining signatures. Question 3. How can early disclosure of agency relationships and conflicts of interest help reduce complaints and disciplinary actions? Transparency builds trust. When clients understand who represents whom and any potential conflicts before entering a transaction, misunderstandings are reduced, expectations are managed, and the likelihood of complaints decreases.